Gary Stevenson has just released his Channel 4 documentary, How to Get Filthy Rich. We watched it the other day. It's terrible. It's awful. And some Gary Stevenson fans are really struggling to cope with that because it was just atrocious. Even the course-selling guy, who is a total snake, you know, loser, should have been easy to humiliate. Gary sort of just folded to. I genuinely don't understand how you cope with it as a Gary fan. You know, it really is. And I gotta mention this in the video we're about to take a look at. It's his biggest strength is portrayed as his ability to campaign, his ability to communicate. And he just shows a total failure to do that in this documentary. Because most serious people will accept that a flat wealth tax is actually not a great policy, but they recognize that it's a good vehicle to start the conversation and to bring about actual workable policy solutions. But he doesn't even manage to do that. He doesn't even manage to do that. It's pretty shameful. But we're going to take a look here. Novara Media, which is a UK lefty media org, online media org, alternative media outfit, has Ash Sakar and Aaron Bastani hosting on this episode. They speak about Gary's documentary here. And we're going to see them try and work through some of the discussion around the wealth tax. And you'll see Aaron try and be a bit more reasonable, and Ash's brain just, I don't know. I don't know what she's doing this episode, man. It's quite funny, though. We'll take a look.
And has a blockbuster new interview with Aaron Bastani, which is going gangbusters on our YouTube channel. But it's his documentary with Channel 4 that has been fueling a greater amount of online discourse. And that discourse is particularly focused on a debate that Gary had with tax expert Dan Needle. Samuel Leeds, a landlord influencer. We've discussed him before on this show. He featured in Gary's documentary, tweeted this. Gary's economics has just ruined its credibility and proven that it clearly knows very little about economics. The absolute tax legend Dan Needle destroyed Gary in his own documentary. The very documentary, just a compilation of Gary being proven wrong time and time again about his solution to economic inequality. Let me know if you've watched it. The Dan Needle debate has got to be one of the best moments in the show.
So this was something that was a bit of a question before, or while we were watching this, I should say. While we were watching it. Is this guy, I believe it's Dan Needle, right? Let me just run this back. Yeah. So Dan Needle claims that in this report about a wealth tax, they called it a non-starter. And Gary is replying saying, no, they didn't. They didn't say that at all. They actually did say that, but they describe it in the terms of being a non-starter in the foreword, and then later they elaborate more. And Gary's pointing to the elaboration and discarding the description of it as a non-starter, even though that's what Dan was citing to him. So
watched it. The Dan Needle debate
Dan
was
actually right
in the show. Now that tweet and the attached video, which we're going to show you some.
I've reviewed Nina Geraci on Kick. I hated it.
Moment and has clocked up 3 million views. And Samuel Leeds has had some establishment backup for his interpretation as well. So John Stepek is a reporter at Bloomberg and executive editor of Money Week. So he said, I find this fascinating. This is about that clip that we shared. I mean, kudos for allowing it to go out. I'm assuming Stevenson had some editorial control, but I'm not sure what he was trying to achieve here. The centre-left Guardian has also sort of put out the idea that Gary had just completely lost this argument. So the Guardian gave the Channel 4 documentary 2 stars, calling it an embarrassment.
This is the biggest sign. This should be the biggest sign to any lefty that supports Gary. The Guardian gave it 2 out of 5 stars. They don't hate wealth taxes. They don't hate lefties. They're not in support of the wealthy or anything like that. It's just a terrible documentary.
Viewer said that the show allowed its host, that's Gary Stevenson, to be totally out-argued by all his interviewees. So that was a quote, that was their interpretation. So what's in this damning exchange between Gary and Dan Needle, which we're told completely discredits Gary Stevenson and his claims to know anything whatsoever about economics? Well, this is the part of the show that Samuel Leeds shared.
So my proposal is a 2% tax on wealth of above £10 million.
Absolute populist claptrap, and the people pushing this should be ashamed of themselves. If the Chancellor stood up and said, we're going to have a wealth tax, we're going to have 2% on all wealth over 10 million, it would require, let's be generous, like a year of planning at least. You then need to build the systems. You need to tax 20,000 people. You're not going to raise any revenue from a wealth tax before 2029. You could be in favour of wealth tax, but anyone claiming that it's an answer is deluded. Well, the Wealth Tax Commission did a huge amount of work on the wealth tax, more than anyone else in the world, maybe more than everyone else put together. They concluded an annual wealth tax is a non-starter, and that was as a result of the work that they did.
What they concluded?
That's what the report says.
What I saw was that they proposed that for revenue raising, a one-off wealth tax they preferred, but they said explicitly in the paper, if you're worried about inequality, that will not be enough. And if you're worried about inequality, you probably want to look at annual wealth tax. That's what was in the report.
Well, it wasn't that strong. The foreword said, and I quote exactly, but the foreword said exactly that it's a non-starter for the UK.
There are limits to the extent of redistribution that can be achieved using existing tax on wealth, even after effective reforms. An annual wealth tax could be justified on this conditional basis.
That's pretty weak.
Is that saying it's non-starter?
The foreword says an annual wealth tax is a non-starter.
Yeah, it says both. It says both. But there's reasons why it's a non-starter that go beyond, it conditionally potentially being justified for inequality, if you really want to take things that far. It's about the fact that it's unworkable, that it's a massive project, that the policy won't raise that much revenue, and obviously that's going to make it unappealing to politicians. It's a non-starter. It is a non-starter of a policy.
It's a very strange clip because he's saying that report, and Dan Needle is saying, this is the most sort of rigorous report that's ever been done on wealth tax, says that it's a non-starter. And then Gary reads him a quote which says, if what you want to do is reduce inequality, then an annual wealth tax might well be justified. And then he says, well, that's a bit weak, isn't it? To me, it looks like Gary has kind of contradicted him. Also, the objection that it would take more than a year. Dan Needle's a big advocate for a land value tax. I think that's very good arguments for a land value tax, by the way. I'm very much in favour. The argument for a land value tax over...
See, dude, you literally... Okay, so we'll slow it down here. So I do have a little bit of appreciation for Aaron Bastani. I don't totally hate the guy. And it's because of moments like this. It's because of episodes like this, where you do see him. You see the rational side fighting for control, man. You do see it.
Property tax is that, as Dan Needle
so
said...
he is supporting like a land value tax here, which... Land value tax would be epic.
I think there's very good arguments for a land value tax, by the way. I'm very much in favour. The argument for a land...
Wait, this one isn't Aaron Bastani, is it not? Don't mix them up. Don't mix up the two kind of bald white guys. This is, what's his fucking name? I don't remember this guy's name. What's his name? They say it in another episode.
Welcome to Novara
It's this guy, isn't it?
Live. Coming up tonight, Ed Miliband appears to be ruled out as the next Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's set instead to be Shabana.
Michael Walker. Sorry, I repeatedly refer to him as Aaron Bastani when he's not. That's the other guy who's on this network. This guy, I prefer to Aaron Bastani in that case, because every time I hear this guy's pretty reasonable. I usually only see Aaron Bastani on Twitter, I'm not gonna lie. This guy I used to see on Novara. So I'm going to just mix the two up.
Land value tax over a property tax is that, as Dan Needle says, if you tax something, you do tend to get less of it. But you can't, less wealth, sort of less investment would be bad. Less land, we can't have less land. So a land value tax kind of really encourages people to develop their land. That's why Henry George liked it. Anyway, though, their disagreement there seemed to be about this particular Academic Wealth Tax Commission report. So I went and looked up that report. So it was published in 2020 by an economist and two legal academics. To much fanfare, it got lots of sort of official funding. And confusingly, both Dan Needle and Gary Stevenson can claim to be in part right. So the foreword to the report is written by Gus O'Donnell.
Aaron Bastani just posts shite ball knowledge of the England team all day.
Who is a former head of the civil service. So Gus O'Donnell wrote in the introduction, "This report will not change everyone's mind, but I welcome it as an important contribution to the debate. It has been led by a team with the essential mix of skills in economics, tax law and administration, who approach the subject with an open mind. They conclude that an annual wealth tax is a non-starter in the UK, and we should fix our existing taxes on wealth instead. However, a one-off wealth tax is a very different proposition. They think it would work and could raise £250 billion over 5 years. This is a striking conclusion, and it comes at a crucial juncture." Now, the context here, by the way, is that they thought a one-off wealth tax, this was obviously published sort of during COVID, and I think the argument was that loads of money has been spent by the government, and we could sort of plausibly say this is a national emergency, we're going to do this one-off wealth tax, and that wouldn't change really people's behaviour. They wouldn't be able to try and move their wealth out of the country because you backdate it and you say this is only happening once, so you've got no reason to leave Britain. So you're trying to sort of reduce the incentive to flee with your wealth by just doing it once, but they thought you could make a lot of money doing this. That's just the context. However, the actual report does really back up what Gary is saying, right? So they argue that it's not going to make that much money, an annual wealth tax, but for other reasons you might want it. So this is from that report. If the only goal of an annual, so this is not from the forward, this is from the actual authors of the report. If the only goal of an annual wealth tax is to raise relatively more tax revenue from people with wealth, this does not necessarily require a new wealth tax. Existing wealth taxes could simply be adjusted, and this would bring in more revenue from people with wealth. If the goals include actively reducing wealth concentration, rather than merely raising necessary revenue from those with wealth, a wealth tax with a high rate could achieve this, but only if avoidance behaviours could be minimised. So exactly what Gary's saying, right? If your aim is not necessarily to raise revenue, but to reduce inequality.
But this is the thing, right, is that's extra measures. Like if you're bringing in an exit tax as well, that's a whole other thing that you have to get people to sign on to, right? It's already going to be tricky to pass a wealth tax, that's already going to be tricky. The idea you're getting people on board with an exit tax too,
then as long as you do it right, an annual wealth tax could be justified. Elsewhere, they say this. An annual wealth tax would only be justified in addition to these reforms to existing wealth taxes if the aim was specifically to reduce inequality by redistributing wealth. We do not take any position on whether the government should use tax policy actively to reduce wealth inequality. So basically, Dan Needle wasn't misquoting the Forward, but Gary Stevenson can point to this document, which Dan Needle said is the best research ever done on this, and say, well, my argument has been specifically we should tax wealth not necessarily to raise revenue. It doesn't seem like it is a great revenue raiser, actually, but to reduce inequality. And this report says if you want to reduce inequality, then maybe the wealth tax is a good idea. Ash, I've seen so many people share that, saying Gary Stevenson got completely owned. I can't believe they let this go out in the documentary. Like loads of reviews, The Guardian, The Times, they're all just saying Gary Stevenson got completely owned. And that basically he's just a campaigner.
There's a reason The Guardian's saying that.
Dan Needle kind of said, this is populist claptrap, and then sort of ignored the quote from the document. I'd actually quite like to watch like an hour-long debate between the two, because I do think Dan Needle and Gary Stevenson have different strengths. Like Gary Stevenson, brilliant sort of analyst of the economy, but he's not a specialist when it comes to sort of tax law. Dan Needle is. I think they could have a very productive conversation, but for me, that wasn't it.
So I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be an expert on tax, Michael, but you know what I am an expert in?
All right, Ash.
Vibes. And how it came across to me...
Not looking good.
That Dan Needle objects to Gary Stevenson as a political figure. And I think that he has an objection to Gary Stevenson and thinks that he's a populist rabble-rouser, maybe, doesn't like his proximity to, the sort of radical left or the movement left. It's also worth pointing out that Dan Needle stood as a Labour First candidate for the Labour Party NEC. So he himself has... a bit of a political origin story. He was the sort of main driver behind that look into Zach Polanski's council tax status, despite not understanding the sort of ambiguity around,
houseboats,
marinas and houseboats and that kind of stuff. So it sounded to me, and from watching it, it seemed like they weren't really... that Gary Stevenson came in wanting to have a debate about a wealth tax, and Dan Needle came in wanting to discredit Gary Stevenson as a political public figure. And so...
Dude, Gary was just trying to have a conversation. This guy trying to debate him. Dude, it's so lame.
Of expressing yourself, saying, well, in the Forward it says this. Stevenson was right. Well, in the report it says a lot of other things. And so what's going to be more important? The contents of the report, which have multiple authors, or the Forward, which is written by a single individual, right? Like, how are you going to balance these things? But Dan Needle just kept on driving, and it seemed that there was a sort of crescendo that he wanted to get to, which is you're talking nonsense and you don't know what you're talking about, right? And there's this accusation of, well, it doesn't really seem like you've really thought about it. So to me, how it comes across is that Dan Needle, and I think, this is what political operators do, right? Like politics is fundamentally about conflict. I would do the same thing if I was him. Dan Needle had, in a sense, one eye on the clip, one eye on the edit, knowing that heat makes good TV, right? People love those clips where it's X destroys Y. We know that. We love those clips.
Well, this is such worthless analysis,
man.
Way
to sort of...
he was trying to get clips. He was trying to get dunks. Okay.
Humiliate,
just get to the point.
Really, or to sort of harm the reputation of someone by basically being quite aggressive in your posture. I'm not saying aggressive like violent or aggressive like threatening, but just being, quite, I'm not going to back down on a single point here. And I think Gary Stevenson went in looking for a conversation. So there were two people with mismatch aims, right? Misalignment in what they were going in for. And I suppose if I were Gary Stevenson, I'd walk away from that being like, oh shit. It's not that I should have prepped on the facts, because he was prepped on the fact. It was that he should have been more prepared for, I guess, the political purpose that Dan Needle, I think, had going into that conversation.
I mean, if we want to be really wonky, we could actually, because it's interesting, the difference between the Forward and the report. And I think this probably gets to why there is lots of difficulty in introducing a wealth tax. I mean, obviously, as Gary talks about, you're going to get lots of rich people campaigning against it. But from the perspective of a civil servant and someone in the Treasury. So Lord Gus O'Donnell, who wrote the Forward saying it's a non-starter, he's a former chief of the civil service. So he cares about what civil servants care about, what the Treasury cares about. And if you're in the Treasury and you're told, well, there's this tax, which is going to be quite difficult to implement. It's going to be quite politically difficult. And it's actually not going to raise you that much revenue. You're going to say...
So this is very, very reasonable here.
right? Because your job as a civil servant is to try and maximize the revenue you get so that you can afford to spend things on stuff, right? Whereas Gary is interested in the distribution of power in the country. And the economists and the sort of legal experts who've written the report have said, we're actually neutral, really, about the distribution of power. If what you care about is the distribution of power in the country, then maybe the annual wealth tax is a good idea. If what you want to do is raise money in the simplest way of people with wealth, it's not the best idea. And if you're a civil servant, you're saying, okay, well, let's not even do it then. But that, you know, so I think there's potentially sort of an interesting tension between the civil servant and the economists. And
Okay,
we'll
what's
see how that
Ash's
plays
response
out
to this?
in the
Let's
Andy
hear
Burnham
what Ash is
government.
thinking.
Let's move on to a different point here. So later in the clip, we showed you half the clip.
Well, dude, when's it
that
going back
was,
to Ash? That's what I want.
Shared
She
by,
just like can't
Samuel
take it,
Leeds.
basically.
You can look up.
Okay, look. So basically, they play a clip of Gary talking about how we should have an exit tax as well. And they're like, well, actually, he has spoken about he has thought about capital flight because here's a clip of him saying we need an exit tax too. It's like, okay.
Then you are totally in the mercy of the rich at all points.
So, I mean, he has thought about what happens if the rich people go away, which is you have an exit tax. And by the way, that's not most people, even sort of wonky Dan Needle types, you know, if they talk about what they say, you can only have a wealth tax if you have an exit tax. So let's do the wealth tax and the exit tax. Now, the argument against it is that means that people will be less likely to sort of come to Britain and invest when they could do it elsewhere. Obviously, we don't really want people to come here and invest in our already existing housing. There's no point in that. That doesn't help us. But if they come in and invest in businesses, then obviously there is some benefit to that. I suppose sort of from this discussion we just had, the critique which I think would maybe be valid is that Gary's wearing a tax wealth not work t-shirt. And if the argument is that a wealth tax isn't actually going to raise much revenue, but
So this is such a tepid version of the critique, okay, that he's about to go with. This idea that, oh, well, you're wearing a tax wealth not work t-shirt, that slogan doesn't really work.
The critique which I think would maybe be valid is that Gary's wearing a tax wealth not work t-shirt. And if the argument is that a wealth tax isn't actually going to raise much revenue, but it'd be good because it will reduce inequality and be good for the balance of power, it's not going to replace taxing work. You are going to have to do both, right? So maybe it is too easy to say tax wealth not work.
Well, look, I think tax wealth not work is a slogan which is pointing out that, you know, where the tax burden is falling is on people who
No,
are
it's
also
literally,
being
it's
crushed by...
they go with the defund the police, retarded line of thinking. Where it's like, yeah, sure, the slogan isn't actually what is going to happen or what anyone means. But it's just like a slogan. It's just like a slogan, man. How about you get like a slogan that reflects what you want to do?
You know, utility bills and rent and mortgage interest rates and so on and so forth. And this is a point that you've made a million times, which is the more work you put in for your money, the more you seem to get taxed on it. So wages get taxed at a higher rate than investments, which get taxed at a higher rate than inheritances. So, yeah, I think that's just speaking to that idea. I think that people do need to be honest about why they support a wealth tax. So I support a wealth tax, and I often make the case for a wealth tax through the lens of here's the revenue it brings to the Treasury. But the real honest answer is that it's...
So, and she has it. So I don't think Ash internalized what Stephen Walker, whatever his name is, said there. Because he's obviously laid out, it's not a good revenue raising method. But Ash is going to go here, oh, well, one thing about it is it's a really good revenue raising method.
The revenue it brings to the Treasury. But the real honest answer is that it's to do with concentrations of wealth and what they do to a society, right? All the things that it locks people out of, all of the things that it locks people into. So it locks people out of property ownership for themselves, locks them into, you know, a rentier economy where they're just being squeezed for everything that they've got. And it also has this warping, distorting effect on democracy and political practices. And so from a political philosophical point of view, as well as a sort of, this is good for the Treasury, I support a wealth tax. And I suspect that Gary Stevenson sort of falls into the same camp. And so I think that this is where the sort of public-facing communications needs to just be expanded that little bit, which is talk about it in terms of revenue, talk about it in terms of how you'd make it work as a policy with exit taxes. And also, this third thing is make a political case based on what kind of society do you want to live in.
I just mean because the revenue, I do think the revenue is not going to be insignificant, but
So
I do think one of the reasons the Treasury isn't implementing it is because they think the revenue, like there is a bit of a risk introducing any new tax and the revenue won't be amazing compared to other things.
Like, this is just crazy how tepid people have to be, how tepid these lefties have to be about Gary, man. No, you know it won't raise that much revenue. You know there's an insane cost on collecting it. You know there's insane cost and time time spent on creating the infrastructure to collect that revenue. You've said that. You know that. You obviously know that to be the case. You've obviously heard these arguments. You obviously understand that to be the case. And you're just like tepidly like, I mean, there is a risk that it won't really raise that much revenue. No, you know. Come on, dude.
Things. So I do, like, obviously you can make the argument based on revenue, but basically I want a wealth tax. I think Gary Stevenson is like fantastic. I do think that single-handedly he has put this on the agenda, and that is all for the better. Whatever the technical difficulties, the fact that we're debating how to do it, I think is brilliant. My one problem, I suppose, with part of this discourse is when people think the wealth tax is the answer to every problem.
It's obviously not. It's obviously not.
So we don't have to worry about spending on this or that because just tax wealth. We can't increase this tax. We can't increase income tax because just tax wealth. It's like, it's actually not going to do as much as you hope it will
and
do.
I think this is the thing, right? Which is tax wealth not work is a riposte to the imbalance of taxation in the country that we have. But if you look at Scandinavian countries, which are often cited by the left as we want to be more like this, it's got actually higher rates of income tax than we have here.
On like middle class.
On middle class.
So tax wealth not work is just like a total bullshit slogan.
Working class people.
On middle class and working class people. What you have that counteracts that is a higher level of sort of like public provision, like what it is that the state does and what you can expect from public life is a lot higher. But
super cool. If you want to call in and do a retarded MMT debate, then feel free to call in, but I'm not doing it with you from chat because it is genuinely the lowest IQ shit in the world. And I can't be fucked to argue with some retarded chatter who doesn't have to answer questions properly. So, no, it is. I know you're immediately going into MMT shit. You can pretend it's not, but it is. It's creeping under the impression the government actually needs taxes to raise revenue. In simple terms, yes. In simple terms, yes. Is it exactly like that? Is exactly how the mechanisms function? No, it's they change numbers on a computer and they just simply, it's just like, oh, we're just deleting revenue. Obviously, we all understand that. The issue is that you do actually need to keep your country's finances in line, especially if you're not the central currency like the dollar, because other countries, companies in other countries have to have faith in your currency, have to know your shit's not totally fucked, so you can't just fucking endlessly go around doing whatever the fuck you want, okay? And you certainly can't just make endless heat pumps, because that's a money multiplier. That's fucking retarded, and there's no evidence to suggest that you don't get diminishing returns from that. Zach Polanski's a fucking retard. So literally whatever you're about to say is fucking retarded. Call into Discord, or I'm not talking to you about it.
You have wages of middle class and working class people being taxed a lot more. And I think it's fine to have that discussion. And I just think on that point about Gary Stevenson being such an effective communicator, that's why there's been this full court press on saying he did a shit job at the documentary, because it's about attacking your opponents where they're strong, not where they're weak. So rather than going, oh, Gary Stevenson, he's wearing shorts on Newsnight and his knees are really bony, right? Like, instead, it's about this thing which we know to be the sort of core of his appeal, which is that he's a very, very good communicator, saying, well, he's actually really shit at that. Look, he did this thing of like public-facing comms and it was really, really shit. It's the same way that, to go for Jeremy Corbyn, you attack his record as an anti-racist, right? Like the stuff about being scruffy and riding a bike, right? No one really cares. So you attack where they're strong to be able to discredit your opponent's strengths, because that's so much more effective than going for your opponent where they're weak.
So, how do you explain The Guardian? The Guardian said it was a terrible piece of communication. They said it was a 2-star out of 5 documentary. They said it was an awful piece of communication, that Gary failed. They're not Gary's enemy. The Guardian are not Gary's enemies. They're not just attacking him where he's strong for the sake of tearing him down. No, it was a terrible piece of communication, a terrible job. There's a reason they all feel so confident talking about the documentary and they aren't trying to sweep it under the rug. So, absolutely shameful.